We moved to Nantucket in '86. I became fascinated with the history of the island, and I was also a stay-at-home dad. And so I spent a lot of time with the kids. And the more I got interested in the history of the island, the more we would go on what they came to call wild goose chases, where we'd go through out into the moors and other places that were of historic interest to me. And the kids became a real part of my introduction to history. And I think it was when Ethan got into first grade, which meant that he was away at school till 2:30. Suddenly I had till 2:30 all to myself, and that's when I realized I now had the time to write my first work of history, which was Away Offshore, a history of Nantucket. So the kids had a big impact on not only how I first got to know this island, but it was Ethan's schedule that finally gave me the time to start writing about it.
Is there anything you really enjoy doing on the island? Like any big hobbies?
Yeah, well, my wife Melissa and I met teaching sailing at a yacht club on West Falmouth on the Cape, and I used to race sailboats. And so when we moved to Nantucket, we really didn't know anyone on the island. But we knew it was surrounded by water, so we figured sailing had to be a big part of it. It was a great place to sail. I had a sunfish at that point, and I decided to launch a comeback as a sunfish sailor to try for the Sunfish North Americans in 1993, a championship I had won 15 years before. This is what they call a midlife crisis. And I used it as an opportunity to sail all the ponds on Nantucket. I used them as my training program. And so this was a chance for me to explore the island by water. So I also sailed the harbors and things like that. But sailing has been a real part of my life and in my life on Nantucket. And as our kids got older, I began to realize that most kids on Nantucket had never learned how to sail. And so along with some others, started a program called Nantucket Community Sailing. That now there's a sailing team and things like that. And it's so much fun to look at the harbor and see those boats out there on a cold, windy spring afternoon, knowing that the young people are learning how to sail.
After writing In the Heart of the Sea, did you ever think it would be turned into a movie?
It was funny. After writing Away Offshore, one of the chapters in that book was about the whale ship Essex that was rammed by a whale, sunk, and inspired the climax of Moby Dick. And so that's what inspired In the Heart of the Sea. And, that came out in 2000. It changed a lot of things in my life because it became a bestseller and that kind of thing, which was really cool. And I remember that year there was interest from Hollywood. And in fact, there were several what they call competing offers. And I was told I had to make a decision in the next hour and a half. And we were just boarding the ferry to go to Hyannis, which is, of course, back then there was no fast ferry. And so it was the slow boat, 2.5-hour ferry ride. And so Melissa and myself were on there realizing we had to make a decision one way or another. And ended up making a decision. Nothing ever came of the movie. I thought it would never be a movie because most books that are what they call optioned never actually made into a movie. And then lo and behold, 13 years later, learned that a actor, Chris Hemsworth, Thor, had attached himself to the screenplay, and which ultimately meant it was turned into a movie directed by Ron Howard. It was a really fun, weird experience. When they were filming it in England, they had built a downtown waterfront Nantucket, and it was just absolutely surreal to get on the plane, fly to London, and then just 24 hours later walk out onto a Hollywood version of Nantucket. But yeah, no, it was an exciting experience. The more I think about it, when I write these books, for me, it's kind of an act of exploration. I write these books not because I know what I'm an expert. I write them because I'd like to read a book like that, and I'm curious. And so I really love the act of finding new things, of learning.
What do you think some other, come up with any other biggest impacts that influenced your writing?
Yeah, it's funny. I was a really shy kid in high school, and even through college, and after I got married, I had a hard time talking to people I didn't know, and I was frightened. And after graduating, I thought I was going to become a English professor like my father, and I went to Duke for a year and realized I don't want to do this. I want to get out there somehow. So I got a job at a sailing magazine with a bunch of young editors, and it was great. It was where I learned how to be a writer, and so that was a very big influence for me. But even more than the writing was the fact that I learned how to talk to people, and by interviewing people, I had a technique in which to interact. And I learned, well, you just ask people questions, and people love to talk about themselves. And so that became my strategy. Okay, I'll just start interviewing everybody. And it was a great gateway into socializing in a normal way. And so that was a huge influence for me. And it's one that still is very powerful in my life. And so I owe that a lot.
So, being a historical writer, how do you think you've impacted Nantucket's community or just the island itself?
Well, it's funny. I think it's more a question of how the community has impacted me, really. I was at home with the kids, and I didn't get out much. So I did write away offshore, and that, I guess that did have an impact. It was a local bestseller when it came out, and it's always kind of funny to. And then In the Heart of the Sea, obviously, had a much wider impact. And it is kind of funny to be on the ferry seeing someone read your book or in a restaurant and hear someone start talking about it. It's nice to have done something that people find some value in. And to be honest, I care. This has become my home. We've now been here 32 years. I can't think of living anywhere else. And it's kind of gratifying to have had, some influence on people learning about the island, and young people who are living here learning about the island. So yeah.
So, other than you affecting the island, do you do any volunteer work as like a side option?
It really began at the Mariah Mitchell Association, because what would happen is I was at home with the kids, and we'd have lunch. Now what do you do? And so I began to look for places with libraries where I could take the kids. And back then, the Mariah Mitchell had a science library that had a very good kids section. And so we would go there, and the librarian, Jane, was just terrific. I was invited onto that board, and working with that organization was terrific. And almost the same thing happened with the Athenaeum. The kids' library back in the 80s was in the basement. And every time it rained, the basement would flood and the wall-to-wall carpet would shrink. And I was one of the few young people using the library, and so was invited to come on that board. And that was amazing, because it was just when people were realizing that the library was very important to Nantucket, to downtown.
So, before we finish off this interview, do you have anything else you want to tell me?
Well, you guys are great interviewers. This is great. I mean, I have to say, having worked a lot in Nantucket history, it's reading articles from the past in which old-timers were interviewed were immensely helpful to me in getting a sense of what happened in the past. Now that I'm an old geezer, it's great to have this opportunity, and so I think this is just what you guys are doing is terrific.
Thanks.
Thank you.
One thing I found interesting was meeting someone from the Nantucket community and getting to know the process of being an author.
Another great thing I found was how Nathaniel Philbrick, to do his research, he went to the certain places where the history occurred. And I found that was great way to learn because you experience it for yourself and you get to know how it happened.